Policy and Regulatory Insights webinar, hosted by me from EDF Business Solutions and joined by our Policy and Regs team. We are planning to cover some key energy policy and regulatory changes that we've seen in 2025, looking at the emerging trends in policy which are expected to impact commercial and industrial energy users, and looking at some anticipated regulatory developments and government priorities for 2026. I'd like to welcome the Major Energy Users Council and its members who are joining us today. Before introducing the speakers, just to cover a little bit of webinar housekeeping, the webinar is being recorded, so it will be available afterwards for anyone who wants to refer back or for anyone who couldn't make the call live. We will be holding some time at the end to answer questions, so do submit any questions you have through the Q&A function. If you can submit them throughout the call, and then we will get to them at the end. If there's any we can't answer, we'll take them away. So I think if we can move on to slide 3, I'll just introduce the speakers. Thanks, Dan. Lovely to be here. My name's Eloise Ogden. I'm the Senior Manager of Market Development here at EDF Business Solutions. And we've been joined by 2 of our experts from the EDF Policy and Regulations team, Dan Alchin and Roy Collins. So without further ado, I will hand over, and I think we're starting with Roy first to look at the agenda for today's call.
Yes, thank you very much, Eloise. And good morning, everyone. For any of you who've joined these webinars before, we're going to follow a fairly familiar approach. We'll look at some of the overarching policy developments that have taken place in 2025, looking at what's happening on clean power and the government's 2030 ambitions there, some of the major developments in new low carbon generation, some of the political developments in this space. We'll cover the government's decision on zonal pricing, and we'll have a little bit of a look forward to 2026 and beyond, and some of the trends that we're expecting in the energy policy area there. And then I will kick us off with that topic, and then I'll hand over to Dan, who will look a little bit more at some of the specific developments affecting customers in the policy and regulation area. So Dan, if we go to the next slide, and let's start with Clean Power 2030. So I'm sure many of you will be aware when the new government came to power in the summer of 2024, the Clean Power 2030 mission was its sort of big, I guess, headline feature in the energy policy space, and the new distinguishing aspect of the government's policy. And clean power has definitely remained a strong focus throughout 2025. And that mission and that target requires both a substantial rollout of new renewable generation, but also alongside it a big corresponding increase in our network infrastructure. Looking at the renewable side of things, the key policy measure there is the Contract for Difference scheme, and we're seeing in process now the next auction round 7, which will contract for new renewable generation projects. The government's been working on this throughout 2025, and they've made quite a few changes to the scheme this time round, with the objective of getting both a bigger and a more competitive scheme, and potentially lowering costs. So those changes include allowing fixed bottom offshore wind projects to bid into the scheme, even if they don't have planning permission yet. That increases the number of bidders. The government has also said that this time round the contracts will be available for 20 years rather than the previous 15, and that aims to lower costs as well, by giving greater long-term certainty on prices. More recently, the government has announced the budget for auction round 7, and that's, I think, in the industry been viewed slightly disappointingly as being at the lower end of their hopes, and maybe there's been some speculation that this could suggest some softening of the government's commitment to the clean power agenda. I guess we'll have to see on that. One of the new aspects this time round is that the government can, the phrase is, they can peek into the auction outcome and have a look at the results and potentially choose to contract for more even once the auction has taken place. So that's going to be a very interesting development for early in 2026 to see where we end up on that. Alongside the contract for difference scheme, there's been continued approvals by Ofgem for the expansion of our transmission network infrastructure, both through approvals for specific priority projects and through the overall RIIO process with the transmission network companies. So that is delivering quite a substantial increase in the network infrastructure, which I think we in EDF see as necessary. There has been underinvestment in networks over the past few decades. However, at the same time, there's a difficult balance here because obviously this is having an impact on tenuous charges that are faced by all of our customers. So, and people are beginning to see the impact of that in bills. So this is again a bit of a difficult balancing act for the government in terms of its overall ambitions. Another feature of the Clean Power 2030 programme, which we touched on last time, is been the reordering of the connection queue. You may well have seen stories about the huge number of projects that have been awaiting connections, which is built up to very, very high levels and has led Ofgem and NESO to develop a new process which seeks to prioritise the most ready projects for connection rather than the previous first come, first serve process. So that reordering of the queue, all the details and rules of how that's going to work has been developed this year. Companies have bid in, as it were, with their latest information. And now just towards the end of this year and through 2026, we will see projects getting their new connection dates out of that process. So a lot happening still in the Clean Power 2030 space, and a lot more that we can look forward to in 2026, sorry, and obviously beyond. I guess worth bearing in mind the very substantial progress that we have made already in this area. Last year, 2024, over 70% of electricity generated in GB was either from nuclear or renewable sources. That's a record level. And our carbon intensity was at 105 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, which is a very low level relative to the past. Only about 15 years ago, the comparable figure was around 450. So we've seen something like a 75% reduction in the carbon intensity of the GB power system over the past 15 years. So very substantial progress. Relatively speaking, internationally now, Britain has a very clean power system, but obviously there is still further to go to reach the government's 2030 mission, which is for around 50 grams per kilowatt hour. Okay, Dan, let's go on to the next slide. So alongside the developments on renewables, we're also seeing quite significant progress now on some of the other low carbon generation options that are needed for a fully clean power sector. A very positive development from EDF's perspective, obviously, has been securing a final investment decision and and funding for Sizewell C, with a number of major private investors coming on board the project alongside the government. That project is being funded in a new way under what's called the regulated asset base model. So a bit more like how a network infrastructure and some water infrastructure is funded in the UK. But in of the design, the objective is very much to the Hinkley Point C project and build on all the learnings and experience of building that power station. Not just Sizewell and Hinkley that have been the focus for nuclear this year. We've also seen interesting developments on the small modular reactor side of things. The government has announced Rolls-Royce as the winner of its SMR competition, and that program now is moving forward into its next phase, and I expect we'll see more on that in 2026 as Rolls-Royce works on its design and looks at the sites for its first SMR developments. There's also nuclear interest from other companies and other projects as well now. A couple of announcements associated with Donald Trump's recent visit to the UK. We saw Centrica and X Energy announcing ambitions to do new nuclear projects at Hartlepool. And EDF, we were involved in an announcement with the US SMR company Wholesale around a potential development at Cottam. So yeah, a lot happening now in the nuclear space. Alongside that, we've seen developments on gas with carbon capture. Net Zero Teesside is a project being developed by BP and Equinor in Teesside, achieved financial close early this year, and BP and Equinor have now been rolling out the major contracts for that project, which will be the first, as I say, the first gas station in the UK with carbon capture fitted. We've also got other work on the carbon capture cluster in the northwest, HyNet, which could see some further gas with carbon capture stations being developed as well. And then finally, another interesting development this year has been the launch of a cap and floor scheme by Ofgem for long duration electricity storage projects. That's effectively either pumped hydro or lithium battery or other kinds of battery technology projects. And the initial phase of that competition, the eligibility assessment has completed, and there are some 70 projects now competing for contracts under that scheme. So across all of these technologies, we are effectively looking at the what one might say is the low carbon, firm and dispatchable power that is needed to complement a renewables dominated power system and help achieve overall clean power through the 2030s and beyond. Long way to go on all of these projects, but definitely considerable progress this year. Okay, Dan, let's keep going. So I think now turning to the political side of things, I think we've seen very substantial change. Maybe started last year and before that, but really particularly significant this year, with what can only be described as a very clear end to the political consensus on net zero. We have a position now where the official opposition, the Conservative Party, and the party leading in the polls, Reform, have very clearly stated that they do not support the net zero by 2050 carbon reduction targets, and they would change or amend or repeal the associated legislation for that target, which is set up through the Climate Change Act. So this is, a real departure from, quite a long period where there was consensus amongst the major political parties around decarbonisation. What's behind that? I guess fundamentally the biggest issue is the question of energy costs. I'm sure you've seen a lot in the news about the high costs of energy, and particularly the high costs of electricity in Great Britain. And in that context, and in a broader context in which economic growth has been relatively limited, we're seeing a lot more debate around whether net zero is affordable, what are the costs of decarbonisation, and so on. And we're seeing quite a split on the political side now between the Conservatives and Reform, who are arguing that decarbonisation and net zero is a significant factor behind our high electricity costs, and the government, which instead is pointing to the gas price and the volatility of the gas price as the fundamental concern in this area. So very different perspectives on the question of high electricity costs. I think the reality is it's a complex topic. These sort of simple narratives are not enormously helpful in looking at all the details. I'm sure we will talk more about energy costs, both in this webinar and in future webinars. People are interested. Our director, Josh Buckland, published a blog recently on LinkedIn, which gives a lot more detail on EDF's perspectives on the issue of electricity costs and what we can do about them. But it's very clear that it is now a major area of political debate, and that is going to affect the energy landscape going forward. It obviously creates some uncertainty for all the companies looking at investments in this area and whether they will have political support going forward. And that's something that all of the companies operating in this space now need to think about and take into account. And I'm sure we'll see further focus on this in coming years, also particularly around the question of the costs of different schemes and the costs of constraints is probably something you've seen media stories about. This is when the network is unable to deliver all the renewable power, particularly wind, to customers. And so what we see then is that wind stations are paid to turn off and gas stations are paid to turn up. And this again has been sort of feeding in, and the growing cost of this is been feeding into the debate around energy costs in GB. Okay, Dan, let's keep going. So another major development this year has been around the government's decision not to proceed with zonal pricing. I'm sure you've heard about this story in the news. So over the past few years, there was a very lengthy review of electricity market arrangements in the GB market, and that generated a lot of debate in the sector, very competing views, particularly on this question of whether it made sense to split the GB market into a range of different zones, have different wholesale prices in those zones, or to retain a single national market at the wholesale power level. Eventually, this summer, the government announced that it was deciding not to proceed with zonal pricing. The key reasons for that it cited, I think, were the complexity of the change. Zonal pricing would indeed be a lot more complicated market to operate in. The time it would take to deliver a zonal market, this would be a very complex regulatory change, new legislation, new codes, many consultations and so on. And I think the government concluded that overall the complexity and the time involved was not worth it for the scale of potential benefits that zonal pricing could deliver. So we are retaining a national market, but that doesn't mean that there won't be any changes. There is now a programme to look at reforms to the national market, and that work is ongoing, and we're expecting the government to publish more on it later this year. I think from the customer's perspective, there is probably considerably less change from this decision than would have been the case with zonal pricing. kind of changes that we will see now in a national market are more related to the government's role as a planner for the location of network and the location of generation. But we will also, alongside that, or we expect to see some changes to network charging, particularly for generators, but also potentially for customers as well. So we could see impacts in that area. And alongside that, also some reforms to the balancing mechanism. This is the mechanism by which the system operator makes sure that we have a balanced system delivering power across the country, maintaining it within all the necessary limits and so on. And all of that, I guess, is ultimately aiming to deliver a more efficient system, which keeps costs down as we transition to a lower carbon electricity system. Okay, and then I think my final slide is, which we'll move to now, is just a little bit of a look forward to next year and some of the issues that we're likely to see, and also going beyond 2026. So firstly, on the clean power side of things, I think we touched on some of that earlier, but early next year, hopefully we will see the outcome of auction round 7. We will see how many projects the government is offering contracts to. We'll see the prices of those contracts. And that will tell us a lot, both about how achievable Clean Power 2030 looks, and also at the costs. And obviously that links into some of the political debates that we've discussed. We also mentioned the connection queue. Projects will be getting their new connection dates throughout 2026. And again, I think at an overall level, that will give us a good flavour of what can be connected over the coming years to deliver Clean Power 2030. We should also see the first of these long duration storage contracts being entered into by Ofgem, and the continued rollout, and I imagine further developments on the nuclear side of things as well. Looking at some of the energy markets, I'm sure we'll see a continuation of some trends that we've started to see in recent years. This is notably very big growth in the battery sector in the GB market. We have a very substantial pipeline now of battery projects. Some of that reflects the opportunities in the GB market from a more renewables dominated system, which has more fluctuations in supply and therefore pricing. Also reflects falling battery costs at an international level, which are making batteries increasingly competitive. Alongside that, we're seeing growth in the solar PV market, again driven, I think, by falling costs at a global level. Solar is almost certainly now the cheapest way to generate electricity, even in a not particularly sunny country like Britain, and that we're seeing the effect of that in the projects that people are coming forward with and the growth of that market. EV sales are also continuing to rise, which is obviously positive for electrification and decarbonisation. Some of that potentially alongside, hear a lot about data centres and AI, is that we may now be gradually moving into a situation where electricity demand will start to rise. And that is quite a transition from recent years where we've seen either flat or slightly falling demand over the past decade or so. And then on the kind of energy politics side of things, it seems very clear that this debate around net zero and the costs of decarbonisation is going to continue. It's going to be a big feature going forward, with interesting decisions for the government as to how much it kind of challenges that. It seeks to create a political divide, or how much it looks to focus itself on energy cost reductions to try and limit the strength of that debate. We're going to see some changes, I think, around carbon pricing. The UK and the EU have agreed, at least in principle, to link their carbon pricing schemes. We should see progress on that next year. And finally, I think interesting a debate worth mentioning around electrification and the costs and issues around electrification. So EDF has been making the point that not only is electrification a key measure for decarbonisation, but we also see it as a route to help bring down the costs of energy over time. And that's because if we can electrify more sectors, we can start to spread a lot of these costs that are on the bill, the network costs, the policy costs. We can spread those across bigger demand, and in that way we can actually help to bring down the unit cost of electricity for everyone. So that's, I think, an important message that we and others are trying to make. But obviously the challenge for that is you need attractively priced electricity if you want people to switch. And so we're also kind of pushing for changes in that area that will help to make electricity cheaper and therefore more attractive. Okay, so I think that's hopefully been an interesting summary of some of the policy issues and debates, and I'll hand over now to Dan to take a closer look at some of the customers' markets issues.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you very much, Roy. Before I dive into sort of the latest trends in regulation, and particularly regulation of sort of the non-domestic and INC markets and what's coming up, looking ahead to next year, given what Roy just pointed out there in terms of the pressure on costs, as we do every year at this session, just quickly, if we reflect on sort of where wholesale power prices are now, I think it is worth noting that this is not as interesting or as dramatic a slide as it perhaps was in 2022 or 2023. But it is worth noting that power prices still remain elevated compared to what they were pre-crisis. Obviously not to the same extent they were before, but nonetheless up. But as Roy has carefully pointed out, this is only part of the story, right? And there are other components and factors that are also affecting sort of the overall prices of energy that you will pay and that we will all pay. Roy has helpfully pointed out to the blog we recently published on the topic, and I think Eloise, Penny, we should definitely share that with attendees after the session. Lots of analysis in it. Takes a domestic lens, purely because the price cap's quite an easy thing to track and project forwards. But the trends we are talking about and the ideas and solutions are as applicable for the non-domestic market as they are the domestic. So it's worth a read if people haven't had a look already. If I jump on to sort of the latest sort of policy regulatory developments in the non-dom market, I think we have seen already this year, and this will continue into next year, some of that political focus on cost start to come through. It was there in the industrial strategy earlier this year, where the government announced a change to existing support that is in place for energy intensive industries, and also additional bill support for some manufacturing companies. So the first of those is the supercharger uplift. So the government confirmed earlier this year that they plan to uplift the current EII discount on network charges from 60 to 90% from April next year. That scheme, of course, works a year in reverse. So the discount will start applying to the network charges those companies incur from April, but the money will ultimately make its way back to those impacted customers from April 2027. But that is obviously then going to be funded by corresponding increases in the non-energy costs that sit on the rest of our bills. Equally, the government announced the BIPS, the British Industrial Competitiveness Scheme, so that alongside the existing suite of support for EIIs, plans to introduce additional financial support for about 7,000 businesses in the manufacturing sectors. Worth saying on the BIPS scheme, we know very little more than what's sort of set out on the slide at the moment. A consultation from the government is due imminently on detail of the scheme and how it will work. But I think one of the things is worth saying is we are again expecting that corresponding increases to non-energy costs on everyone else's bills will be how the scheme is paid for. And government will try and offset that by trying to bear down on costs elsewhere on the bill. But again, it will be bill funded is what we understand will come forwards. I should say more broadly on non-energy costs, we do have a separate webinar where we'll be deep diving into the full story with some of the individuals in our sort of price stack and modelling teams on the 16th of December. So certainly the difficult, hard questions, store them up, save them for then next month. And colleagues will be there to help with those. But I did think it was worth just pulling those out because they sort of set the picture of where the government's current committed thinking in terms of supporting businesses with costs currently is. We obviously got a budget coming up in a couple of weeks. There's lots of stories in the press about what the government may or may not want to do to support domestic customers. I think what we do know is that public finances are incredibly tight. And therefore any additional support is going to be very, very hard to come by and hard to fight for. But we'll let the press speculation continue, and we will see where the Chancellor makes her decisions at the end of the month. So in terms of other regulatory changes, I think it's been a really fascinating year, 2026, because I think a lot of the stage is being set for big decisions that are going to come next year and the year after. And therefore, I wanted to highlight 4 or 5 of sort of the big sort of overarching regulatory themes that are impacting the non-domestic market at the moment. The first one I wanted to pull out was the Ofgem review. So as you may be aware, DESNZ, so the government department, has been running a year-long review of Ofgem, looking at its roles, its functions, its powers, its duties, and effectively, what does it need to have and how does it need to be set up to be successful going forwards. The outcomes of that review are ongoing. I think generally we can probably expect, some simplification of Ofgem's duties and remits and probably some expansions of its powers in some spaces, but that's all still to be determined and announced. Hopefully we'll hear that from the government at the end of this year, before the end of this year. That was certainly their timetable. I think what we are already seeing, though, and we saw it actually at the start of this week on Monday, Ofgem are already moving ahead. I think they're prejudging the outcomes of that review, and Ofgem have already committed and are committing to saying, we know we need to regulate energy markets or the retail market differently going forward. So currently they've got consultations or call for evidences out there looking at how they can move to a more outcomes-orientated approach to regulation. So setting the outcomes they want to see the market and suppliers achieve for customers, rather than prescribing how we do things. And then also looking at where they can use automatic penalties or fines more. So that's something that's quite common in the domestic sector. One of the big open questions they're looking at is should, and if so, how far could that could those sort of measures be extended into the non-domestic space? But this is very much Ofgem, I think, preempting what they expect government to say in the review and trying to get ahead of the game and say, we ourselves adapting and evolving our regulatory framework to make sure it's fit for purpose going forwards. The other big sort of overarching regulatory topic is TPI regulation. For lots of us, this has been something we've been working on and talking about and discussing with government and Ofgem for many, many years. We have now had government come forwards off the back of the Ofgem non-domestic market review last year and commit to introducing direct regulation of TPIs. So it will be an authorization regime. They intend to appoint Ofgem as the regulator, who will then set principles, specific rules, and will then sort of do monitoring and compliance of TPIs in line with those principles and those rules. The cost of all that regulation will also be met by TPIs. I think one of the big interesting questions now is Ofgem are now sort of have had that ball thrown back over the fence to them by government. And Ofgem are now trying to take that work forwards and kick off discussion with suppliers and TPIs about how they look to introduce that regime. If there are any TPI partners on the call today, worth noting, we understand Ofgem are looking to set up an initial workshop with TPIs to discuss their initial thinking. We will share an invite with our partners as soon as we have that from Ofgem to make sure you're involved in those discussions. But it's going to be a long story, right? I've said this before. I've said it in different ones of these forums before. Government reached a similar place in relation to heat network regulation 3 or 4 years ago, right? And we are still some way away from having a heat network regulation regime in place. So while the decision has been made, this is going to be a project that runs for a couple of years, I would imagine, because there are lots of I's to dot and T's to cross and process to put in place to get Ofgem ready to do this. Third stream I was going to flag then is Ofgem. We talked about costs, we talked about non-energy costs. In particular, Roy highlighted some of the challenges about where we expect network costs to go in the future. Ofgem are very alive to this, and one of the big projects they've also kicked off this year is what they call their cost allocation and recovery review, where they're asking the question, is the current system, in terms of how costs are recovered from consumers, predominantly for electricity on a fixed basis for network costs through standing charges, fair? And does that remain the best and most appropriate means of recovering those costs going forwards into the future? Review, predominantly in terms of how it's been presented, I think because of a lot of the political pressure, is domestic focused. But I think it's important that we recognise that the review isn't limited to domestic. It will also have inevitable implications for the non-domestic sector as well, and therefore is something we at EDF will be keeping a close eye on, because it's asking fundamentally to deal with some difficult questions and real complex trade-offs about what ultimately is the most fair and most efficient way of recovering fixed costs across the customer base. But again, it's another programme that's expected to roll on through next year, probably into 2028. And then the final one I was just going to flag on this slide is another sort of long gestating one. But we are in the midst of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol doing their sort of latest review of their international accountancy standards for carbon emission reporting. We've seen them recently issue public consultation on their plans for Scope 2 reporting. And there's some potentially quite interesting or dramatic developments there, I guess. So they're proposing to keep dual reporting requirements, where you report based on sort of your locational emissions, but also market-based approaches, so things like REGOs. But one of the things they have suggested for the market-based method is actually a requirement, particularly for larger customers, to move to hourly matching, which would obviously be quite a shake-up of that market. I think given the GHG protocol have consulted on it, it's probably highly likely to happen now. I think the big questions to watch out for over the next couple of months are, well, what are the timelines for that implementation? What are the transitionary arrangements for companies as we move from one set of requirements to another? And where are those exemptions or those thresholds about where any new rules start to bite? It will then also have some potential knock-on consequences both here, but in markets around the world, about how we make sure our systems and processes are best set up to report changes in those international accountancy standards. And then the final two things I just wanted to flag today is developments. Smart is another really interesting development in recent weeks and recent months. So the current smart meter framework, which is based on hard targets in the non-domestic sector, looking at rolling out smart metering to profile classes 1 to 4, comes to an end at the end of this year. So government across both domestic and non-domestic have been asking, well, what is the correct framework going forwards to get meters out to those properties that have not yet made that change to smart metering or advanced metering? The department have decided to put forward two very different proposals for the domestic sector and the non-domestic sector. In the non-domestic sector, I suppose they're looking at, in a way, I suppose what you could describe as a bit of soft mandation, I think. So what they are planning or proposing to do is that from the 1st of January 2027, suppliers will be required to have smart contingent terms in all of their fixed term contracts. So if you are a non-domestic customer and you're looking to sign a new fixed term contract with a supplier, that contract will have to have a term that involves you agreeing to take on a smart meter. It's an interesting one, given that a lot of fixed-term contracts already have such provisions in them, and I think there'd probably be some debate about how effective or ineffective those actually are at driving out the rollout, but this is where the current proposals are at. I think the other thing that's also quite interesting is the current proposals are limited to those smart designated premises as per the current rollout, but there is sort of quite an open-ended question the government are asking of actually, should that be expanded to all non-domestic premises? So that'll be one to keep a very close eye on, particularly over the first half of next year as the government look to land a final position. And then the final thing I was just going to mention was flexibility. I think last year we talked about the Clean Power Action Plan and how it had some quite lofty and big goals for accelerating the amounts of flexibility available to the system operator to help meet Clean Power 2030, as Roy talked about earlier. The big development in that space this year is that we've seen DESNZ, the system operator, and Ofgem come together to publish an action plan for how they will, or a roadmap, sorry, for how they will achieve that big step up in flexibility. In INC, I think the big thing there and the big message, I suppose, is that the NESO is actually really, really keen to talk to non-domestic customers about what they think their opportunities may be, what they think their challenges are, and I think is keen to work with companies that can have potentially significant flexibility loads to help address barriers and blockers. So I think my ask for people today is if it is something people are interested in, we can help make those links, we can make those introductions, and that's something we would be happy to do. There's then some longer term projects that are sort of mentioned in the roadmap that I think will run out over the next few years in terms of improved data sharing, ensuring interoperability of equipment, looking at some potential options around final consumption levies, and reforming them so that, you know, being flexible pays off. Some of those things are easier than others, but they're all very high level and not a huge amount of detail at the moment. But it's definitely another interesting space to keep an eye on with 2026 in mind. And I think with that being said, I think it's back to you, Eloise, for questions.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks. We've had a few questions submitted. If you've got any more, do add them in. Before I go on to the first one, just Andrew, you've submitted a question about the NHS. I don't completely follow your questions. If you could maybe add a little bit more into the Q&A, and then I'll come back to that one. I'll start with one that was actually submitted ahead of the session from Chris, I believe. So Chris said, Ofgem's announcement of TPI regulation is welcome, but will take primary legislation to be passed, consultation periods, there may be unforeseen delays, there may be inefficiency in the process, all of which mean it is not enforced for a long time. Are EDF looking to make any changes to their TPI processes in the meantime that will mirror the likely regulations? I'll give Dan and Roy a little break for a moment and answer that from the EDF Business Solutions point of view. Obviously, there's still quite a bit of work for Ofgem to do. They're about to start reaching out to TPIs to start developing their principles, etc. We don't expect to be changing our processes in the meantime. It is obviously, you know, for Ofgem to regulate. We work with a relatively small subset of the many TPIs in the market who we expect to already be following the principles which we expect Ofgem will develop in the first phase of their move. So as Dan mentioned, we will forward on the invite from Ofgem to their first TPI sessions. But yeah, we're not expecting any changes until that comes through directly from Ofgem. Right, so first question. Roy, I think this is one for you. Can you say any more on how the NESO generator and demand queue reform process is working, particularly when results will be known? So, you know, I think they're asking whether any existing connection offers for early to mid 2030s are likely to be withdrawn or delayed.
Thanks, Eloise. So, so there's a lot of detail here. I guess a limit to how much we can get into it, but at a headline level, so everyone in the queue has submitted their details to the NESO. That took place this summer, and the NESO is now looking at all of that. You know, and that I think is a combination of reordering the queue, as mentioned, based on this kind of first ready, first connected principle, rather than the first come, first served one. And, you know, must also involve working with the individual transmission companies in terms of what is achievable, you know, in terms of the delivery of connections. So that process is happening. Our understanding is that the first connection offers will start to come through very soon, probably in December of this year. But most people, or most projects, will get their new connection offers next year. And there is a kind of rolling program for that. Won't get into all the details, but depending on the timing, ambitions for your project, that determines, broadly speaking, when you'll get your new connection offer. But everyone, I think, as I understand it, will have their new connection offer ultimately no later than about Q3 next year. So that's kind of where the process stands. And will some connection offers be withdrawn or delayed? I think the answer to that is yes. You know, some people will come forward in this process and end up with an earlier connection offer. but some people will go back, and their connection date will go back in time, or maybe effectively withdrawn, at least back to the very sort of first stage. I guess what's behind that, I think you may have seen a lot of stories about what people described as zombie projects in the connection queue. And I guess as a sort of illustration of that kind of situation is where, let's say, for example, a battery storage developer wants to do a project in east of England, and they apply for 3 different connection locations. So the process, in the past has been kind of effectively free to put in a bid for a connection. So we've seen a lot of companies and projects put in several offers effectively, where they only ever intend to use one, and that's the kind of zombie project element of the process that NESO is trying to filter through, and by seeking evidence, determine which projects are really going ahead or which are in a position to go ahead, and to prioritize the connection offers for those. But that does mean that some projects will have later offers, or maybe kind of put right to the back of the queue. Yes.
Thanks, Roy. Go on to a couple of quick ones, hopefully. So, Dan, can you confirm, is the current EII discounts expected to continue as is alongside the new wider BIC scheme?
Yeah. So they are expected to be parallel schemes. So the current exemptions will continue running, and then the idea is the BIC scheme sits alongside it and targets businesses in the manufacturing sector that may or may not, well, probably don't currently benefit from those exemptions.
Okay, thank you. There's another one on EIA. We might not be able to answer this one, but I'll just check in case you do know this off the top of your head, Dan. If the EII discount is to rise to 90%, which it has, that decision has now been made, what impact does that have in pence per kilowatt hour for non-EII customers?
Yeah, I've just been trying to manically look this up in the government response, because it's not a definitive answer yet, because of the way the obligation works and how it's offset for a year. We don't quite know what our costs are yet, and then it will come down to how suppliers decide to price it through. So it is probably more one question for the 15th, 16th of December webinar.
Okay.
But let me just give me 1 minute just to finish reading this and checking back on my notes, and then I'll come back to you, Eloise.
I'll try and give Roy a question then. I think this is one for you, Roy. From Harry, so thanks for your question. What are the prospects for reforming the marginal pricing of electricity to end the predominance of gas setting the price for power, and hence enabling the benefits of cheaper renewables to be reflected in the power price?
Yeah, thanks, Louise. Yeah, very good question, and a topical one. Certainly over the last few years, this has been discussed a lot. It's quite a complex topic. I guess a few things to say. So firstly, I think, we do expect the role of gas in setting the wholesale price to fall over time. And I think we're seeing that a little bit already, and we expect to see more and more of that as there are more renewables on the system, and also more battery storage and other low carbon dispatchable options. Then we do expect gas to be setting the wholesale price less over time anyway, even without any further market changes. So I guess that's the first thing to say. Second thing perhaps to say is that the CFD scheme effectively does achieve that outcome, because when wholesale prices are high, customers get the benefit from that. When they're low, they pay the price of the renewables by through the top ups. And obviously, the more we use the CFD scheme over time, then the more we are insulating customers from volatility in gas generated power prices, and that's one of the arguments for using the CFD scheme. But obviously there is a lot of power that's outside the CFD scheme, and that is still today effectively having its price set by gas. A range of ways of changing that were considered in this review of electricity market arrangements exercise over the past few years. But I think, the crudely that there was no simple answer that people could identify that was necessarily very effective in achieving that for power outside the CFD scheme. And so the government is not, as things stand, looking to try and take forward a new mechanism in that area. And I guess perhaps it's also worth bearing in mind that, the merits or otherwise of doing this also depend a lot on what the gas price is. Because gas prices go up and down, and when gas is relatively cheaper, gas generation is relatively cheaper. And at the moment, there's not a huge amount of difference between the price of power from an existing gas power station and the contract price that prices, or the kind of level of prices that we expect to see in the forthcoming CFD auctions. So there's not obviously a big prize available at the moment by removing that kind of marginal price setting role. If you bear in mind that while the marginal cost of renewables is obviously very low, if you're looking to have an effectively viable project, you do need to pay that renewable power to enough to recover its capital costs over the long term.
Thanks, Roy. I know we could talk about that one for a lot longer, but I'm going to move on because we've got a few more questions coming as well.
Answer for you, please, if it's helpful.
So, sorry?
I've got an answer for you on the previous question. So the DESNES, the DBTIA put it at about 40p per megawatt hour, the cost of the uplift. So that takes the total cost of the supercharger to about £1.70 or £2 per megawatt hour, is their estimate.
So that's the cost for non-EII customers. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks to Andrew, who sent in his question. So I think this one is really around, so Andrew said cost to large business customers was indicated as being discussed. And as the NHS is possibly one of the largest consumers in the UK, is the NHS being considered for inclusion to these discussions? I guess that's related to the BICS scheme coming out, which is obviously aimed at manufacturing companies. Have you heard anything, Dan?
No. So as I say, what we know at the moment is these are the two schemes that they have announced. They were obviously announced in the context of an industrial strategy, and therefore I think that gave it its focus in terms of on supporting EIIs and manufacturers. In terms of additional support for the public sector, not something currently aware of. And as I think we all know, it's an incredibly tight fiscal environment, isn't it, at the moment? But yeah, no, it's something, not something we're aware of.
Thank you. This is an interesting one. Given power prices are going negative at peak solar times with the current installed capacity, what do you see happening as the installed capacity is tripled?
Yeah, I can have a go at that, Eloise. Yeah, very interesting question, and a good point, and another area that is sort of links to lots of debates about the future electricity system. I mean, it sounds a bit of a cop-out maybe, but I guess the short answer is we don't know what will happen because there's a lot of factors in this area. So obviously, yes, you're quite right. Growth, much more growth in solar. We would see lots of times in the summer when there is surplus solar generation in the middle of the day. But then the question is, well, how do we handle that in the electricity system? Now, we talked about the big growth in battery storage developments. We've also talked about the Ofgem's cap and floor scheme and pumped hydro. So, one scenario is that we see effectively a big increase in storage in the electricity system, and that helps to absorb this peak time solar and then supply it to the electricity system, later in the day or at another time later in the week, and so on. And so in that way, we use the solar effectively. The other area, in this context is our kind of more, kind of domestic business level flexibility, and particularly, around things like EV charging. If we have more time of use tariffs, can we effectively encourage large numbers of people to charge their EVs, around these times as well? And that, again, there's a huge potential capacity there to take this solar power and take advantage of its availability. So how all of that will ultimately play out and what that will mean for the kind of price of electricity at these future periods, when we've got large amounts of solar, a little bit hard to predict. That depends on the growth of storage, the growth of flexibility, and so on. But certainly there are different scenarios in there which could see more periods of negative pricing. Again, another potential option is to export more of that power through interconnectors. So a lot of moving parts that will affect, I think, how that plays out.
Thanks, Roy. I'm afraid we're about to time out. So we haven't gone through all the questions. If you've submitted your question and we have your name, then we will respond to you. If we haven't got to your question, but it was anonymous, then if you can flick to the last slide, Dan, we've got our contact details if you want to send them through, and we will endeavour to get back to you. As you leave the meeting, you will be asked to give some feedback. We'd appreciate if you can do that. Thanks again to Dan and Roy for all their expert advice. As mentioned several times, our next webinar is on non-energy costs, so do sign up for that. And please follow us at our LinkedIn EDF Business Solutions page. Thank you all for joining. See you next time.